Australia's geography is so bizarre that it breaks every rule about how continents are supposed to work, and the explanation for why it is this way will completely change how you see the planet. We are talking about a landmass where 90% of the population lives on 3% of the land, where the interior is basically uninhabitable, and where the weather patterns are so backwards that scientists had to invent new terms to describe them. Here is what blows my mind about Australia. Every other continent has rivers flowing toward the center, mountain ranges that create predictable weather, and populations spread relatively evenly. Australia is the complete opposite. The rivers flow away from where people live, the mountains are in the wrong place, and almost everyone is crammed onto a narrow coastal strip while the rest of the country is simply empty. How does that even happen? Let's start with the most obvious weirdness. Australia is the flattest continent on Earth. The average elevation is only 1,080 feet above sea level, which is nothing. Antarctica averages 7,500 feet, Asia averages 3,000 feet, and even Africa is higher at 1,900 feet. Australia is basically a giant pancake with a few bumps on the edges. But here is where it gets interesting. Australia used to have massive mountain ranges. What happened? Erosion. Australia is the ancient continent geologically, sitting in roughly the same spot for 200 million years, while wind and rain slowly wore down the mountains. The Great Dividing Range along the east coast is all that is left, topping out at only 7,310 feet. That is barely a mountain by global standards. This flatness creates the first major geographic problem. Australia has no natural barriers to stop desert conditions from spreading. In North America, the Rocky Mountains create rain shadows and distinct climate zones. In South America, the Andes do the same thing. Australia's mountains are too low and too close to the edge to affect the interior climate, which means the center of the continent is just desert, lots of desert. The Outback covers about 70% of Australia, and it is one of the harshest environments on the planet. Temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Areas go years without measurable rainfall, and landscapes are so barren that early European explorers literally died trying to cross them. The Simpson Desert has sand dunes stretching for hundreds of miles. Lake Eyre, Australia's largest lake, is dry most of the time and only fills maybe 4 times per century. And you know what is crazy? Australia is surrounded by ocean, but it gets less rainfall than almost any other continent. Only Antarctica is drier, and that is because Antarctica is frozen. Australia should be getting moisture from the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, but the way air currents work in the southern hemisphere means that most of that moisture never makes it inland. This is where Australia's geography gets really weird. The continent sits in what is called the subtropical ridge, a persistent high-pressure zone that pushes storms away. When moisture does reach the coast, the Great Dividing Range blocks it from reaching the interior. So the east coast gets decent rainfall, and everything west of the mountains gets basically nothing, leaving a dry interior. Sydney receives 47 inches of rain per year. Alice Springs, right in the center of the continent, receives 11 inches per year. That is less than Los Angeles. But guess what? The river system is even weirder. Most continents have rivers that drain toward the interior and create fertile valleys where civilizations develop. The Nile, the Mississippi, the Yangtze, they all flow through population centers. Australia's rivers do the opposite. The Murray-Darling River system flows away from where most people live and drains into the Southern Ocean in a spot where basically nobody lives. And here is the kicker. Even though it is Australia's biggest river system, it is pathetic by global standards. It moves about 767 cubic meters per second. The Amazon moves 209,000 cubic meters per second. The Mississippi moves 16,792 cubic meters per second. Australia's biggest river has less flow than a medium-sized river in most countries because there is just not enough rainfall. This lack of water in the interior is why 90% of Australians live within 50 miles of the coast. There is literally no reason to live inland unless you are mining something. The coastal cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide are all on the edge of the continent because that is where the water is, that is where the moderate climate is, and that is where you can actually grow food. But the geography gets even stranger when you look at where those cities are. Sydney and Melbourne are on the southeast coast. Brisbane is on the east coast. Perth is on the west coast, over 2,000 miles away. There is no logical pattern because Australia's geography does not create obvious places for cities to develop in relation to each other. Compare that to the eastern United States, where cities developed along rivers and natural transportation routes. Australia's cities are isolated pockets, separated by massive distances of nothing. You can drive from Perth to Sydney, but it is 2,500 miles through desert. That is like Los Angeles to New York, except most of it is empty wasteland. And then there is the climate, which is backwards compared to the Northern Hemisphere. Australia is in the Southern Hemisphere, so seasons are flipped. Christmas is in summer, and July is winter. But it is not just about seasons. Australia's climate patterns are fundamentally different because of how ocean currents work in the Southern Hemisphere. The El Niño Southern Oscillation has a huge effect on Australia. During El Niño years, Australia gets drought conditions that can last for years. During La Niña years, flooding can also last for years. There is no middle ground. The continent swings between too dry and too wet. But here is where Australia's geography becomes truly mind-blowing. The Great Barrier Reef. This is the largest living structure on Earth, stretching over 1,400 miles along the northeast coast. It's so big you can see it from space. It exists because of a perfect combination of factors: warm tropical water, a shallow continental shelf, and the East Australian current bringing nutrients up from the south. The reef is basically the one place where Australia's geography worked out perfectly. Everywhere else on the continent, the geography seems designed to make life difficult. But the northeast coast got lucky with ocean currents, water temperature, and underwater topography, creating this massive ecosystem that is more biodiverse than anywhere else in Australia. And finally, there is the isolation factor. Australia is the most isolated inhabited continent on Earth. It is thousands of miles from any other major landmass, which is why Australian wildlife is so weird. Kangaroos, koalas, platypuses, wombats, these animals evolved in complete isolation for millions of years. When humans finally arrived 65,000 years ago, they found an ecosystem unlike anywhere else on the planet. This isolation also explains why European colonization hit Australia so hard. The continent had no natural defenses against introduced species like rabbits, foxes, cats, and cane toads. These animals spread across the landscape and destroyed native ecosystems because Australian wildlife had never encountered them before. The geographic isolation that created unique wildlife also made that wildlife incredibly vulnerable. So here's what makes Australia's geography so weird. It's flat when it should have mountains, it's dry when it's surrounded by ocean, its rivers flow the wrong way, its population is crammed on the edges, its cities are isolated from each other, and its climate swings between extremes. Every aspect of Australian geography seems designed to make life as difficult as possible, yet 26 million people live there anyway. The whole continent is basically one giant geographic anomaly that challenges every assumption about how continents should work. Which part of Australia's geography surprised you most? Drop it in the comments.